Naya was only a little girl when her world changed forever. She used to live in a small Apache village where life was simple and full of rhythm. She would run barefoot across the red earth, chasing the wind with other children, and sit by her grandmother's side at night listening to stories about the stars. Those stars had always been her comfort, the same lights her ancestors had followed for centuries. She believed they would always watch over her. But one day the sky turned dark for her long before the sun had set. A raid came to their valley and her people scattered in fear. Shouts and smoke filled the air, and in that chaos Naya was pulled away from her family. She was so young, she barely understood what was happening, but she felt the iron grip on her arms and the terror in her chest. By the time the night was over, she was gone from her home, taken far away where no familiar voice could reach her. The men who captured her had no kindness. They brought her to the mines in the desert, where people were forced to dig for silver. She had never seen such darkness before. The tunnels were damp, full of dust, and the air was always heavy. At first she cried every night, whispering to the stars she could no longer see. She called for her mother and her people, but no answer ever came. The guards in the mine had no patience for tears. They shouted at her, pushed her, and forced her to pick up tools far too heavy for her small hands. Slowly her cries faded because crying never changed anything. She learned to stay quiet, to keep her eyes low, and to work until her arms ached. Silence became her shield. Years passed and Naya grew into a young woman. But the girl who once laughed freely was hidden deep inside her. Her back carried the marks of endless labor. Her lungs carried the dust of the mines, and her spirit carried a weight heavier than the stones she lifted. She rarely spoke. Words felt useless in a place where no one cared to listen. The other workers had their own pain, their own struggles. Everyone's eyes looked the same, tired, hollow, and full of despair. Naya's heart longed for the wide open sky, for the smell of pine trees in her homeland, but those memories felt like dreams. She'd been gone so long she wondered if her people even remembered her face. Her days blended into one another. The sound of picks striking stone, the coughs of men in the tunnels, the sharp voice of the overseer. It was all the same every morning and every night. Sometimes she would feel her knees weaken, and if she slowed even a little, a guard's hand or whip would remind her to keep moving. She carried scars not only on her skin but deep in her soul. She had stopped asking why this had happened to her. Survival was all she knew. Each sunrise meant another day to endure, and each sunset meant another night of restless dreams. Sleep never brought peace. When she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face fading, or her village burning, and she would wake with her heart racing. But even with all that pain, a small part of her spirit still held on. Somewhere deep inside, a spark refused to die. There were moments when she stole glances at the world outside the mine. Sometimes she was sent to carry water or supplies, and in those few breaths of open air she would look up at the sky. The stars were still there, though far away. She wondered if they remembered her. She wondered if they could see her suffering. She promised herself that one day, if freedom ever came, she would run under those stars again. But then the sound of boots or the crack of a whip would pull her back to reality, and the dream would sink away like sand slipping through her fingers. The mining town around her was rough and harsh. Men drank, gambled, and shouted in the saloons. Dust covered everything. People passed each other with suspicion in their eyes. There was little kindness to be found, and certainly none for a girl like Naya, who was seen as nothing more than property, a worker to be used until she broke. She had learned to move quietly through this world, to avoid drawing attention. The fewer eyes on her, the safer she felt. Her voice had grown soft from disuse. Days could pass without her speaking a single word. Some thought she was broken completely. Perhaps she was, at least on the outside. But inside, she still longed for something more, though she dared not name it. Hope was dangerous in a place where it was always crushed. The mine itself was like a monster that swallowed light and gave back only shadows. The tunnels stretched deep into the earth, and the air was full of dust that clung to skin and hair. Naya's hands were rough from years of scraping against rock. Her nails were broken, her clothes were ragged, and her face was smudged with soot. Yet even with all the dirt, there was still a quiet strength in her eyes. It was the kind of strength that comes not from choice but from surviving what should have destroyed you. She had seen many people give up and fade away, but she had not. Something in her refused to stop breathing. At night, when she lay on the cold ground, she would sometimes close her eyes and imagine her grandmother's stories. She would picture the great eagle soaring high above the desert, free and fearless. She would imagine herself as that eagle, wings stretched wide, flying far away from the mine back to the green valleys of her people. She knew it was only a dream, but it was the only thing that gave her heart a little warmth in the endless coldness of her life. The men who guarded the mine never thought about what they had taken from her. To them, she was just another worker. But Naya carried memories no one could steal. She remembered her mother's gentle hands, her father's laughter, the songs of her people around the fire. Those memories became treasures she guarded in her heart. They reminded her she had once belonged somewhere. Even though she had been away for years, those memories were proof that she was more than a slave. She was Naya, daughter of the Apache, and her spirit had once known freedom. She did not know it yet, but her life was about to change. A stranger would soon ride into that dusty mining town. A man with weathered boots and eyes that had seen both hardship and hope. She did not know his name, nor that he would notice her when no one else cared. She could not imagine that someone from the outside world would risk anything for her. But deep inside, the spark that had refused to die seemed to wait for something, as if her spirit knew that one day, someone would come and remind her of the sky she had lost. For now, though, she only worked day after day, her heart hidden behind silence, her eyes carrying the weight of years of pain. The mine had taken so much from her, but it had not taken everything. Not yet. The sun was sinking low over the desert when Ethan rode into the mining town. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as he passed through the narrow street lined with wooden buildings. A saloon on one side was alive with noise, men laughing too loudly, glasses clinking, and the sound of a piano playing off-key. On the other side, a blacksmith hammered iron, the sharp sound echoing into the fading evening air. Ethan had been on the trail for weeks, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long in one place. He carried only his saddlebag, his rifle, and the quiet determination of a man who had seen too much of life's struggles. His eyes were steady, his jaw rough with stubble, and his shoulders broad from years of hard work. To most people, he looked like just another cowboy passing through. But Ethan wasn't searching for gold or for whiskey. He was searching for something he couldn't quite name, something that gave meaning to his long days under the open sky. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside to buy supplies. The store smelled of flour and leather, with shelves stacked with beans, dried meat, and tools. The shopkeeper, a weary man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted him with a nod. Ethan picked up what he needed, coffee, tobacco, and a new coil of rope, and set them on the counter. As he waited, he glanced out the dusty window toward the mine entrance at the edge of town. A line of workers was being marched back from the tunnels, their faces gray with dust, their shoulders bent from exhaustion. Among them, Ethan's eyes caught something that made him pause. It was a young woman, smaller than most of the miners, carrying a heavy basket of rocks. Her long dark hair was tangled and her clothes were worn and dirt-stained, but her eyes, when she lifted them for just a second, were alive with a quiet strength. Ethan didn't know why, but the sight of her struck him. Most of the workers looked broken, beaten down by years of labor, but this girl, even with her tired face, seemed different. There was something in her gaze, a spark hidden under layers of pain. Ethan found himself staring until the shopkeeper cleared his throat and handed him his purchases. Outside, Ethan leaned against a post, watching as the workers were herded toward a shack that served as their quarters. The guards shouted orders, their voices harsh. Ethan noticed the way the young woman moved, slow but steady, even when her knees trembled under the weight she carried. She didn't complain, didn't make a sound. She simply endured. He frowned. He had seen unfairness before. The frontier was full of it. But there was something about this that stirred a restlessness in him. Maybe it was the memory of his own younger days, when he had been powerless under the hands of men stronger than him. Or maybe it was simply the way her eyes had met his for the briefest moment, almost as if she had silently called for help. That evening, Ethan walked into the saloon for a meal. The place was crowded, full of smoke and noise. Men played cards at worn tables, others leaned over the bar with glasses of whiskey. Ethan took a seat near the corner and ordered stew and bread. As he ate, he listened to the conversations around him. The miners boasted of silver, the gamblers cursed their bad luck, and the guards from the mine bragged about how they kept the workers in line. Ethan's jaw tightened as one of them laughed about a girl who worked harder than some of the men, calling her stubborn. Ethan didn't need to guess who they were talking about. He kept his face calm, but inside he felt something stir. He finished his meal quietly and left, the laughter of the guards following him out into the night. The moon was rising when Ethan walked toward the edge of town. The mine was silent now, its tunnels dark. Near the workers' shack, a guard leaned lazily against the wall, half asleep. Ethan didn't approach. He wasn't foolish enough to cause trouble without reason, but he stood at a distance, watching. Through a crack in the wooden walls, he caught sight of the young woman again. She sat alone in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. Others were already asleep, stretched out on the floor, but she sat awake, her eyes fixed on the small square of sky visible through a gap in the roof. Ethan followed her gaze. She was looking at the stars. Something in his chest tightened. He wondered what she saw when she looked up there. Was it hope, or was it simply a reminder of all she had lost? The next morning, Ethan saddled his horse early. He intended to leave town after breakfast, but as he walked past the mine once more, he saw her again. The workers were being lined up, given tools, and sent down into the earth. She stumbled slightly as she carried her load, and a guard snapped at her, raising his hand. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He had no claim here, no reason to interfere. But still he couldn't look away. Something about her silence, her endurance, unsettled him deeply. He had seen plenty of women in his travels, but none who carried so much pain and strength at the same time. He asked a man standing nearby about her. The man shrugged and said she was Apache, taken years ago, now nothing more than a mine slave. Ethan's stomach turned at the casual cruelty in his tone. All day he couldn't shake her image from his mind. He wandered the town, bought new horseshoes for his mare, even sat on the porch of the hotel smoking his pipe. But no matter what he did, his thoughts returned to the girl in the mine. Her eyes haunted him, the way they looked both broken and alive at the same time. He remembered how she had stared at the stars as though she belonged to them more than to the earth. Ethan was not a man who acted on impulse. Life on the trail taught him patience, but patience felt wrong here. Something inside him whispered that he was meant to be in this place at this moment, that he had been led here not by chance but by purpose. That night, the saloon was louder than ever. The guards drank and shouted, and the piano banged away in the corner. Ethan sat at a table near the back, watching, listening, waiting. His eyes narrowed as he overheard talk of how the girl had collapsed earlier in the day and had been beaten for it. The men laughed as if it was nothing. Ethan's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. He knew then that he couldn't just ride away come morning. He couldn't leave her in this place, not while men laughed about her suffering. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he knew he would do something. When the night grew late and the town settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan walked back toward his horse. The stars above glittered like cold fire, the desert wind whispering through the silent street. He looked once more at the shack by the mine. He could not see her through the walls, but he imagined her sitting in the corner again, looking up at the same stars he now gazed upon. A strange feeling filled him, like a promise forming in his heart. He did not know her name nor her story in full, but he knew one thing with certainty. He could not turn his back. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would keep watching. Tomorrow he would be ready. The next morning came with the sound of hammers striking rock, voices shouting orders, and the steady rhythm of labor in the mine. The sun had barely risen, yet the air already carried the heat of the desert. Ethan stood near the blacksmith's shop, pretending to check the shoes on his horse, though his eyes were fixed on the mine entrance. He watched as the workers filed out with their heavy loads. Some stumbled, some coughed, but all of them moved under the watchful eyes of guards. Then he saw her again. The young Apache woman. Her steps were slower than yesterday, her arms trembling as she carried her basket. Ethan's heart tightened when he noticed how her knees wavered, as if her body was close to giving out. He held his breath, waiting, hoping she would make it to the end of the line. But before she could, she dropped to her knees, the basket spilling across the ground. The nearest guard's face twisted with anger. "Get up!" he barked, his voice harsh and cutting through the dry air. Naya, though Ethan did not yet know her name, struggled to push herself up, her hands shaking from exhaustion. The guard's boots crunched against the stones as he strode toward her. He raised his hand, ready to strike. Ethan felt his body move before his mind could think. He crossed the street in long strides, his boots echoing sharply on the ground. In a firm voice that carried more steel than the guard's own, Ethan said, "That's enough." The guard froze, his arm still in the air. He turned, scowling at the cowboy, who now stood close enough to challenge him. "This ain't your business, stranger," the guard growled, narrowing his eyes. But Ethan did not step back. His tall frame and calm, steady stare carried a quiet authority. "She's on the ground because she's worked near to death," Ethan replied. "Beating her won't make her stronger." The silence that followed was thick. A few townsfolk glanced nervously in their direction, wondering if trouble was about to spark. The guard's face reddened, his pride pricked by being called out in front of others. But there was something in Ethan's eyes that gave him pause. They weren't the eyes of a gambler looking for a fight or a drunk wanting attention. They were the eyes of a man who would stand his ground no matter the cost. The guard lowered his hand reluctantly, muttering under his breath,
"Keep walking, cowboy."
"You don't know what you're getting into." He turned away, motioning for another worker to pick up the spilled rocks. Ethan stayed still until the guard walked off. Then he bent down and extended his hand to the young woman. She looked at him, her dark eyes wide with surprise and mistrust. For a moment, she didn't move. She had long stopped expecting kindness from anyone. Ethan didn't rush her. He simply kept his hand there, steady and patient. Slowly, almost fearfully, she reached out and let him help her up. Her touch was light, hesitant, as though she was not sure if she could trust the strength offered to her. When she stood, Ethan gave a small nod. He didn't smile, didn't speak more than he had to. He simply said, "Easy now," and stepped back, letting her gather herself. That small moment, brief as it was, stayed with her the entire day. No one had ever stood between her and the guards before. No one had offered her a hand without demanding something in return. She worked the rest of her hours silently, but the memory of his voice, calm, firm, protective, echoed in her heart. When the sun finally dipped and the workers were led back to their shack, her body was weary as ever, but her mind held on to that single act of courage. That night, Ethan made his way quietly to the back of the workers' quarters. The guards were distracted at the saloon, their laughter carrying through the street. In the shadow of the shack, Ethan crouched low, pulling a small cloth bundle from his coat. Inside were pieces of bread and strips of dried meat. He tapped lightly on the wall, then waited. At first there was nothing, but after a moment a face appeared at the crack in the wood. It was her. Her eyes widened in recognition. Ethan lifted the bundle and pushed it through the opening. "For you," he whispered softly. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for it. Food was precious, and she had learned to be suspicious of gifts. But something in his steady gaze told her there was no trick here. She accepted it, clutching it close to her chest. For a moment, they only looked at each other through that narrow space. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. She had not spoken freely in years. Ethan did not push her. He only gave a small nod and said quietly, "Eat. You need strength." Then he rose and walked away into the night, his figure blending with the shadows. Inside, Naya unwrapped the bundle with shaking fingers. The bread was rough, the meat dry, but to her it tasted like freedom. She ate slowly, tears forming in her eyes, not because of the food itself, but because someone had thought of her enough to share it. The days that followed carried on with the same harsh routine, but something was different now. Each time Naya looked up and saw Ethan nearby, whether at the store, on his horse, or standing quietly near the mine, she felt a small thread of safety. He didn't always approach her, but his presence was like a shield. When the guards shouted, she kept her eyes low, but in her heart she remembered the man who had stood in front of her, refusing to let another blow fall. Slowly, trust began to flicker inside her, like a fragile flame that had long been smothered by fear. Ethan, too, found his thoughts circling around her. He didn't know her name, didn't know the full story of how she had come to this place, but he knew enough. He knew she carried years of suffering, and he knew she deserved more than the life she had been forced into. Each night he brought her food, sometimes a blanket, sometimes just a kind word. He never asked for thanks. He only gave what he could, hoping to ease her burden even slightly. He saw the way her eyes began to soften when they met his, the way her shoulders seemed to carry a little less weight when she knew he was near. It stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, a reason to stay in one place. One evening, as the sky turned purple with dusk, Ethan saw her sitting outside the shack for a brief moment before the guards called her back in. Her face was turned toward the horizon, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade. For the first time, he saw a faint smile touch her lips. It was small, fragile, but it was real. Ethan stood still, his chest tightening at the sight. That smile was worth more than any silver buried in the mine. It was proof that hope was returning little by little. But not everyone in the town looked kindly on Ethan's attention. The guards noticed his presence the way his eyes lingered too long on the Apache girl. Whispers began to spread, questions rising about why a stranger cared for someone considered less than nothing by the men who owned the mine. Trouble was brewing, and Ethan knew it. Still, he did not back away. He told himself that if a fight came, he would face it. He had already made his choice. He would not let her suffer alone anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. His life and hers were now tied together by a bond neither of them had expected, a bond born from courage, kindness, and a silent promise under the desert stars. The desert night was cool. The stars stretched across the sky like silver dust. Ethan lay awake in the small room he had rented at the inn, listening to the faint sounds of laughter drifting from the saloon. His mind was restless. Every day he watched the girl suffer. Every day he saw her strength pushed to its limit, and every night he gave her what little comfort he could. But he knew it was not enough. Kind words and scraps of food could not free her from the chains that held her life. She needed more than kindness. She needed a way out. Ethan turned on his side, staring at the ceiling. He had always been a man who moved from place to place, never staying long enough to get tangled in other people's troubles. But this time was different. He could not ride away. He could not leave her behind. The thought alone filled him with guilt. By the time dawn painted the sky, Ethan had made his decision. He would get her out no matter the risk. The next day, Ethan went about his business as usual, buying feed for his horse and checking his gear. To anyone watching, he looked like a man preparing for another journey west. But in truth, he was preparing for something far more dangerous. He studied the guards, their routines, and the way they changed shifts at night. He counted how many men stood near the shack where the workers slept, how many sat drinking at the saloon. Every detail mattered. He knew the escape would not be easy. If he was caught, it could mean his life. If she was caught, it would mean even worse. Yet the thought of leaving her in that place was more unbearable than the thought of facing danger. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ethan walked past the mine one last time. He saw her again, Naya, though he had finally learned her name from a whispered conversation among townsfolk. She was bent over, lifting a heavy basket, her thin frame trembling with effort. The sight hardened Ethan's resolve. He knew he could not wait any longer. Tonight they would leave. When darkness fell, Ethan saddled his horse and tied a second rope to the back in case he needed to guide another. He packed food, water, and a small blanket. Then he slipped through the shadows toward the shack. The guards were laughing in the saloon, their voices carrying drunkenly into the street. Only one man stood watch, and even he leaned against the wall with his eyes half closed. Ethan crouched low, moving quietly until he reached the side of the shack where he had left food before. He tapped lightly on the wall. After a moment, the small crack in the wood opened, and Naya's eyes appeared wide with surprise. Ethan whispered, "It's time." "Do you trust me?" Her heart pounded as she looked at him. She had dreamed of freedom for years, but the idea of leaving filled her with fear. The desert was vast, the men were cruel, and her strength was fragile. Yet something in Ethan's steady voice and the calm fire of his eyes made her nod. Slowly, she pushed the wooden board aside, and Ethan helped her slip into the night. Her steps were unsteady, but his hand was firm at her back. "Stay close," he whispered, guiding her toward the horse. They moved quickly through the shadows, the sound of their footsteps blending with the whisper of the desert wind. For a moment, it seemed they would escape without notice. But as Ethan was lifting Naya onto the horse, a voice barked behind them. "Hey, what are you doing?" The lone guard had spotted them. He stumbled forward, fumbling for his weapon. Ethan swung around, his body shielding Naya. "Go!" he shouted, urging her onto the saddle. The guard lunged, but Ethan's fist met his jaw with a sharp crack, sending the man sprawling to the ground. Before the guard could recover, Ethan mounted the horse behind Naya and kicked hard at the ground. The horse leapt forward, racing into the open desert. Shouts erupted behind them as the guard's cry reached the saloon. Men poured out, weapons in hand, their boots pounding against the ground. Ethan urged the horse faster, the wind whipping past them as they flew into the night. Bullets cracked in the distance, but darkness and distance soon swallowed them. Still, Ethan did not slow. He knew the men would follow, and he knew they had to ride far before dawn if they wanted to be safe. Naya clung to him tightly, her heart pounding with terror and exhilaration. For the first time in years, she was outside the mine with no chains, no overseers, no walls. Freedom was terrifying and beautiful all at once. They rode until the stars faded into the pale light of morning. By the time Ethan pulled the horse to a stop, both were exhausted. They dismounted near a cluster of rocks hidden from view. Ethan gave Naya water from his canteen and she drank greedily, her lips trembling. He spread the blanket for her to rest, but she did not lie down immediately. She sat in silence, staring at the horizon where the sun was rising. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet but unstoppable. Ethan sat beside her, not saying a word. He understood that she needed time, space to let the weight of years pour out. When she finally turned to him, her lips parted as if to speak, but only a whisper came. Why? Her voice was rough from disuse. Ethan looked at her gently. Because no one deserves what they did to you, he said simply. You're free now. The days that followed were both difficult and healing. They moved carefully, avoiding towns where men might ask questions. They drank from streams, ate from the supplies Ethan carried, and slept under the stars. At first, Naya struggled with the sudden change. She often woke in the night, her body tense, her eyes searching for guards who were no longer there. She startled at loud noises, flinched at sudden movements. Her years in captivity had left deep scars that could not be erased overnight. But Ethan never pushed her. When she woke shaking, he let her sit in silence until she calmed. When she walked slowly, he slowed too. He spoke gently, never raising his voice, never demanding. Little by little, Naya began to feel a sense of safety she had long forgotten. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, Ethan handed her a piece of bread. She took it, her hand steady now, and after a long pause, she said softly, "My name is Naya." Ethan's heart stirred at the sound of her voice. It was the first time she had spoken more than a word to him. He nodded. "Naya," he repeated, letting the name settle into the air between them. "I'm Ethan." She looked at him, her eyes meeting his steadily for the first time. Something passed between them in that silence, a quiet understanding that their paths were now tied together. The desert journey was not easy. There were times when Naya's body nearly gave out, times when food ran low, and times when the sound of riders in the distance made their hearts race with fear. Yet through it all, Ethan's presence gave her strength, and in turn her resilience gave him purpose. She had endured more than most men could imagine, yet she still walked forward. Each day her steps grew a little steadier, her gaze a little clearer. She began to smile faintly at the sight of the stars, no longer just with longing but with hope. By the time they reached the shelter of the plains, Naya was no longer the silent shadow she had been in the mine. She was still healing, still fragile, but her spirit had begun to breathe again. Ethan watched her one evening as she stood on a hill, the wind playing through her hair, her eyes fixed on the wide horizon. For the first time he saw not just the pain she carried, but the strength she had kept hidden. It was a strength born of survival, of endurance, and now of freedom. Ethan knew the road ahead was still uncertain. The men from the mine might still search, and the memories of her past would not vanish easily. But he also knew something else. Together, they had taken the first step toward a new life, and that was enough to keep riding forward. The ranch lay in a wide valley where the grass bent with the wind and the mountains rose like guardians in the distance. Ethan had known the place from his earlier travels. A quiet ranch run by a kind family who welcomed hard workers and strangers in need. It was here he brought Naya after weeks of riding through the desert and plains, always careful, always watching for signs of pursuit. When they finally rode through the wooden gate, Naya's eyes widened at the sight. Horses ran freely across the pasture, cattle grazed calmly, and children played near the barn, their laughter carrying through the open air. It was a world so different from the dark mine that for a moment, Naya could hardly breathe. She sat tall on the horse, her gaze drinking in every detail as though she feared it might vanish if she blinked. The ranch owner, a woman named Clara, came out to greet them. She was strong, with silver streaks in her hair and eyes full of quiet wisdom. Ethan had worked for her years ago and she trusted him. When she looked at Naya, she saw not just the dirt and weariness but the untold story behind her eyes. Clara said nothing at first, only touched Naya's hand gently and nodded as if to say, "You're safe here." That silent gesture made tears rise in Naya's eyes. She lowered her head, overwhelmed by a kindness she had long forgotten existed. Life at the ranch was not easy, but it was honest. For the first time in years, Naya's days were filled with fresh air and open sky instead of stone walls. At first, she was cautious, moving quietly, keeping her distance from the others. She was not used to freedom. She woke early expecting to hear the shouts of guards, and at night, she often startled at the smallest noises. But Clara and her family gave her space. They didn't ask questions or press her to talk. They simply let her be, showing kindness in small ways, a warm meal, a blanket, a smile. Slowly, those gestures began to soften the edges of her fear. Ethan worked with the cattle during the day, but his eyes always found Naya. He saw the way she began to help Clara with simple tasks like carrying water or gathering eggs. Her hands were rough, but they were gentle with the animals. He noticed how the children looked at her with curiosity, and how little by little she began to smile when they laughed. Each smile was small, almost shy, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Ethan felt a quiet pride watching her reclaim pieces of the life that had been stolen from her. One afternoon, Clara gave Naya a chance to ride one of the gentler horses. At first, Naya froze. She had never been allowed such freedom in the years she had been enslaved in the mine. But Ethan stood beside her, his hand steady on the reins. "You can do this," he said softly. She looked into his eyes, searching for certainty, and when she found it, she nodded. He helped her into the saddle, guiding her carefully. At first, her grip was tight, her body tense. But as the horse walked forward, something shifted. The wind touched her face, her hair lifted, and she felt the rhythm of the animal beneath her. A laugh escaped her lips, pure, genuine, and full of life. Ethan had never heard a sound so beautiful. Clara smiled from the fence, her eyes shining. That day marked a turning point. For the first time, Naya felt not just safe, but alive. Of course, healing did not come all at once. There were nights when nightmares pulled her back into the tunnels of the mine. She would wake trembling, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan was always there, sitting nearby, speaking gently until the fear faded. He never asked about the details of her past. He knew some stories were too painful to tell before their time. Instead, he reminded her of the present. The fire beside them, the horses in the barn, the stars shining above. Slowly, she began to believe in those things more than in the shadows of her memories. The people in town at first looked at her with suspicion. She was different, and many could not see past her Apache heritage. But Ethan never wavered in his respect for her, and Clara's quiet strength stood by her as well. Over time, the townsfolk began to notice Naya's resilience, her hard work, and the kindness in her eyes. One day, when a storm swept through the valley and flooded the river, Naya worked tirelessly alongside the ranch hands to save the cattle. She moved with determination, her face set with courage. After that, whispers of doubt began to fade. People saw her not as a burden, but as someone with strength they could admire. Ethan and Naya grew closer as the seasons changed. Their bond was not built on grand gestures or spoken promises, but on quiet moments, the way he handed her water after a long day, the way she tended to his horse without being asked, the way their eyes met across the yard with unspoken understanding. Ethan found himself smiling more, something he had not done in years. Naya, in turn, began to laugh softly at his dry humor, finding comfort in his steady presence. They were two souls scarred by life, yet together they found something whole. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold, Ethan found Naya standing on the hill near the ranch. She stood tall, the wind tugging at her hair, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He walked up beside her, silent for a while. Then he said quietly, "You look like you belong here." She turned to him, her lips curving into a small but certain smile. "For the first time," she whispered, "I feel like I do." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. He knew then that his decision to stay had been the right one. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. In the days that followed, Naya began to dream again. She spoke of teaching the children the songs her grandmother once sang, of planting a small garden near the house, of building a life with meaning. Ethan listened, his heart swelling with quiet joy. He never tried to take credit for her healing. He knew the strength had always been inside her. All he had done was remind her of it. Together, they had carved out a new beginning in a world that had once shown them only cruelty. The story of the Apache girl and the cowboy spread slowly through the valley, carried in whispers and glances. Some said it was fate, others said it was chance, but those who saw them together knew it was something deeper. It was the story of two lives meeting in the dust and finding light again. Naya's past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found freedom, and with it, she had found hope. One night, as the stars shone brightly overhead, Naya stood once more on the hill, Ethan at her side. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cool night air. For the first time since she had been taken from her village, she felt the stars were not far away. They were close, watching, guiding her. She opened her eyes and whispered softly, "I am free." Ethan placed his hand gently on her shoulder, and together they stood in silence, their hearts full of peace. The long road of pain was behind her, and ahead lay a future she could finally call her own.